All right, with GPU prices coming down, it's now a lot more interesting, especially at the low to mid-range, to actually considering buying a GPU. And well, yeah, there's new GPU launching at the end of the year. That's usually the high end first. So if you're considering buying in the low to low mid range, it probably will still be a year or so or even more before you really actually do see the new replacements for those. In other words, you might actually be interested in buying something like an RTX 3050 or an RX 6600. Now, these don't cost the same amount of money, although depending on when you look, they might. Their MSRPs are $250 versus $330, and you can find both of them for the MSRP right now, although the 6600 is easier to find at or near its MSRP. I was able to get an RTX 3050 at MSRP from EVGA's website directly, although if you just check at some random point in the day, a lot of times they're closer to $300 or even $320, at which case these GPUs do almost cost the same amount of money. So what we're going to look at in this video is, hey, if you just Google a benchmark that shows the 3050 versus the 6600, you might see that it's somewhere in the, the 6600 is 20 to 30% faster, depending on which game you're looking at or at what average of what games you're looking at. But what does that mean? The 6600, first of all, doesn't have DLSS. It does have FSR, and FSR 2.0 is still a bit of a question mark that I can't explore in this video yet because it's not out yet. What about ray tracing? They both support it. The 6600 is a higher end model, but Nvidia has better ray tracing. So what does that mean? What about using them as budget 1440p cards? I'll even look at what if you happen to also want to play on your 4K TV every now and then? How do they perform at 4K? And what kind of realistic settings might you use? As you can tell with this screenshot behind me right now, we're going to be not just comparing apples to apples. We will. But we're also going to look at how aggressively would you have to use DLSS to catch up to the performance of the 6600 at various resolutions in various games. What about 1080p, 1440p, 4K, RSR, FSR, smart access memory, all of that. Let's jump into the benchmarks and take a look. I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, first we'll start with a apples to apples comparison, but we're definitely going to look at what if we're adjusting settings for each of them. But anyway, what if we just grab Cyberpunk 2077, one of the more graphically demanding games out there, kick it up to Ultra, but use it at 1080p, which is, I think, the most realistic target resolution for both of these GPUs. And you know what? They're both playable, although the 6600 is certainly way more playable. In that bar scene, the 3050 was dipping very low. We can see in the less demanding scenes, the 3050 is much more playable at the maximum settings than it was in the more demanding area, whereas the 6600 is able to pull up into the 60 FPS range, again in the less demanding areas. Neither GPU, though, is really one where I would call these the ideal settings at which to play the game. Let's go ahead and take a look at the averages for comparison, 46.5 versus 57.6. But I think the high settings make a lot more sense here. Now, I recorded my RX 6600 at 1080p high in this game on a driver version, which seemed to be setting the encoder to a darker setting, so don't read too much into that. In the actual gameplay, it looked the same. I know some people like to argue about AMD has better colors than Nvidia or whatever. Guys, these are captured on their encoders. This is not filming the screen, so that's an encoder difference in this setting. But what we can definitely see here is that at the high settings, both GPUs are doing much better. The 3050 can get over 60 FPS in scenes, but certainly does still dip below. And the RX 6600 is delivering very good frame rates here. I think on the RX 6600, 1080p high is the way I would go in this game, as well as using this as a stand-in for other more graphically challenging games that are currently out there. I'm kind of using Cyberpunk to stand in for those. And the averages being 56.8 versus 68.9. Now, again, we're seeing the brightness difference because it's the same footage on the right-hand side, but what did we change on the left-hand side? With the RTX 3050, since we were still below a 60 FPS average, and in these more demanding scenes in the bar area, at the high settings it was well below 60. Personally, especially in a first-person game like this one, I would like to keep my minimums closer to 60 and my averages above 60. So we're basically looking at what would it take to somewhat match the RX 6600's performance. Again, this is one of the things that you don't really see in the just average performance results when you look up a GPU review, is what does that mean in terms of how much would you have to lower the settings to match the performance? So here we're seeing that the 3050 at 1080p medium is actually performing a little bit better than the 6600 at 1080p high, although it kind of depends on the exact scene. Sometimes they're about even, sometimes one has a bigger lead over the other. Let's take a look at the average results. And 73.8 versus 68.9, I think those were good settings. Now, going down to medium is not the only way you could reach an over 60 FPS experience on the RTX 3050. It has access to DLSS, and I thought it would be interesting to see DLSS Quality and DLSS Balanced versus the 1080p native image. And to my eye at 1080p, I really don't like using it. Now, your eye might not be as picky as mine, but when you look at especially in this game, it's a lot of the lines in the pavement in motion look very alias to me, even with DLSS Quality, and it looks significantly worse at DLSS Balanced, although that DLSS Balanced allows you to keep the settings at Ultra, while at high settings you can use DLSS Quality and actually have a significantly higher frame rate. So do you want to go down to medium and keep it native? Do you want to go to high and use DLSS Quality? Do you want to go to Ultra with DLSS Balanced? Personally, I think I'd stick to the native resolution and the medium settings look fine, but others might disagree. You can see the average comparison there. Now, here we're looking at 1440p, and once again we're starting with an apples-to-apples comparison, and once again, on the driver I recorded this AMD footage on, the brightness was lower, so once again, don't read too much into that. Now notice I've already dropped down to the medium settings on both GPUs, because I just felt like this was the most reasonable setting if you're going to go native resolution. The low settings just look way worse. Shadows turn off almost completely on on the people and things like that. And then we'd have to go below native resolution, which we'll look at, but I didn't want to look at that first. So 1440p medium. And it's also interesting seeing how the Ampere architecture does scale better at higher resolutions than AMD's RDNA 2 architecture. So the 3050 percentage performance difference-wise is closing in on the 6600 a little bit, if you look at it as a percentage difference, although it's still significantly behind, and I think the 6600 is definitely giving you, obviously, the better experience. 47.3 versus up near 60, but not at 60. Now, what we're looking at now is, okay, how could you get the 3050 closer to 60 FPS at 1440p? One option is to stay at the medium settings and use DLSS, which we see in the middle of the screen here. The other option is to try going all the way down to the low settings. On the far right, we're still showing the 6600 just at native 1440p medium, which I thought was fine for a budget 1440p experience. Now, here's where I think DLSS looks a lot better. At 1080p, I don't like using it. It's kind of usable, but I don't like using it personally. At 1440p, I think it really helps the 3050 punch way above its weight. And notice that the frame rates it's delivering now are better than the 6600 at native, but DLSS still doesn't look perfect at quality at 1440p, although the trade-offs to my eye are much less noticeable. Those palm tree branches and things, the lines still look a bit alias to me. So I thought that was an interesting comparison. Hey, what about using them as a 4K GPU? This one is kind of just thrown in here for fun, but then again, it's also not, because we're going to look at actually, you could use them as a budget 4K GPU, although I don't think you should buy them for that purpose. Now I'm showing here 4K medium because I think going down to the low settings in this game just isn't worth it. So medium's kind of the lowest preset I would use, and next we'll look at, okay, we clearly can't render it at a native 4K, so let's use FSR or DLSS to try to get us there. The 6600 is almost giving us a 30 FPS experience, and if you're saying that like the actual frame rate difference between the two, it's only a few FPS, well, think of that in terms of percentage-wise. If you look at the actual frame time differences, and the percentage as a percentage, it's bigger than you might think, and you can certainly feel the difference between 20 and 25, for example, when playing. Although again, the Ampere architecture is once again percentage-wise closing the gap on RDNA 2 here. Neither one's particularly usable though, so let's not overthink it. Now, I tried turning the DLSS all the way to performance mode. And on the AMD card, I went with FSR, Quality, apparently a typo there, Quality, sorry for the typo. And these are getting similar frame rates, although the 6600 is doing better. And this is an interesting chance, if you're on a 4K screen, to compare the image quality of the two, because DLSS Performance is upscaling from a 1080p image, whereas FSR Quality, I believe, is still at 1440p, and then upscaling. And it's interesting to me because they both have pros and cons. There's elements of the FSR image that I actually prefer to the DLSS upscale due to the resolution advantage it actually has. Although there's certainly elements that DLSS reconstructs in more detail. I think the actual writing on the signs and things like that actually does look better with DLSS Performance versus FSR Quality. It's kind of interesting. It really depends on which element of the screen you're looking at. Now, neither GPU was delivering a 60 FPS experience, so what if we try to crank it even further? DLSS going down to the Ultra Performance here, I actually think looks quite bad to my eye. And Ultra Performance was really designed, I think, to try to make 8K upscales reasonable. If you look at like the bottles in the background on the bar and stuff there, a lot of the people, I mean, there's weird ghosting and blurring and loss of detail on the DLSS Ultra Performance, and I just think DLSS is falling apart without having enough resolution to work with here. Now, I'm not saying that FSR Balanced looks great on my 4K screen, but I think between the two, I actually do think it holds a more consistent look. It's not as weirdly shimmery and ghosty like on those metal bars we just passed. So yeah, on this one, I think I'm gonna go with, I prefer both the AMD image quality here, and it's got a slightly higher frame rate, although it's not very noticeably different. But what's interesting here is, I mean, you could use these for some budget 4K gaming, although I certainly wouldn't purchase them with that as your main purpose. But what about the ray tracing, guys? Well, once again, ignore the brightness difference for the same reason, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, the 3050 does crush the 6600 at ray tracing, although neither one of them delivers a particularly good experience. These are both the high preset, but with RT reflections turned on. Neither one does a great job at the native 1080p resolution, so both of them are rendering below 1080p. Although I think DLSS does a much better job than FSR at a 1080p resolution. FSR really struggles when there's not a lot of resolution to work with here. So between the two, obviously the 3050 is both delivering better frame rates and the better looking upscale at 1080p. So this is a clear win. Although, like I said, personally, I would not be using ray tracing on either GPU, so personally I wouldn't factor that into my purchasing decision, but you might feel differently about that. Now, here we are with the RTX 3050 versus the RTX 3050. So don't be confused, that is the 3050 on the right-hand side. And what are we looking at? Well, I'm showing you RT Ultra. What if you really did want to just kick on all the RT settings? Well, at the native resolution, it's an utter slideshow. So on the right-hand side, I'm looking at what about DLSS Quality, which, like I said, I don't particularly like using at 1080p myself, but it's reasonable. Other people besides me might like it, so I thought it was worth testing. And it does get you over 30 FPS. Although again, my thought here is if we just play the game at medium or high settings without any ray tracing, I feel like we just get a much better experience. So that's why my initial test was using the RT Reflections rather than RT Ultra. You could certainly look at RT Low or RT Medium. Personally, I find the reflections to be the most impactful, but other people might prefer shadows or lighting. Okay, let's look at a different game. And what are we looking at here? Why are there three things? Well, let's look at Forza Horizon 5, which is a game that certainly has an AMD performance advantage, but especially when you use Smart Access Memory. Now, this is a bit of an outlier, but I did want to mention it because this is a popular game. So if you're actually seriously considering playing Forza Horizon 5, you should absolutely go with the AMD option here if this is one of your main purchasing decisions, especially if you have a compatible motherboard for Smart Access Memory. Smart Access Memory does require certain hardware, but look at that performance difference that it offers if you do have compatible hardware. Although it does seem a bit mixed on which exact CPU and GPU you're using in terms of how much of a performance boost you get. I get an even larger percentage-wise performance boost on my 6800 XT versus the 6600, so interesting. But either way, even without factoring in Smart Access Memory, you can see that the 3050 is oftentimes below 60 FPS at the 1080p settings, whereas the 6600 is even handling 60 FPS in the 1440p Ultra settings. I should also mention that these settings are already turned down a little bit. This game actually features an extreme setting, but I thought on both of these GPUs, the Ultra setting both looks really good and performance-wise made more sense than the extreme setting. And these side-by-side benchmarks, it's already going to run so long in this video, I didn't want to test every single thing. So we went with the Ultra settings here. Now 3050 is kind of usable, and it would make sense to turn down the settings a bit more if you were actually going to use it at 1440p here. But you can see that the 6600, even without Smart Access Memory, is crushing it at 1440p. And with Smart Access Memory, yeah, it's a really good experience. So I didn't want to just gloss over Smart Access Memory, but I really don't think it should be a main purchasing decision unless this is the game for you, because most games don't see that dramatic of a performance bump using Smart Access Memory. So don't expect every game to have that kind of difference. Hey, let's jump over to Red Dead Redemption 2. Now we're looking at 1080p. And this game, I'm using the maximum preset, which isn't labeled Ultra in this game. It's the quality slider slid toward favor quality all the way to the right-hand side. And we can see that the 3050 is not able to lock in 60 FPS in this game, whereas the 6600, I mean, in the most demanding scenes in the game, it will dip below 60, but you can pretty much just max the game out at 1080p and away you go. And I mean, that's not the end of the world if you have to turn some settings down every now and then, but it really is nice when you can just crank the settings and forget about adjusting and just enjoy your game. So sometimes paying a bit more for that can make a lot of sense. And you can see here that in some of these scenes, it actually is a pretty big difference here. Now, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, 50 FPS can feel okay, but we do see the dips going all the way down into the 40s a bit here. It's a big difference. So what if we actually tried to use DLSS? This game does feature DLSS. Now look at his hair. Look at his hair right now. This is one of the games where I think DLSS makes the hair look so much worse in this game that it's something worth pointing out. Also notice that the performance gains in this game don't seem to be anywhere near the percentage gain that we got by using DLSS in Cyberpunk. And by the way, I'll just mention I didn't try DLSS in Forza Horizon 5 because it doesn't feature DLSS. And again, this is a game that has DLSS but doesn't have FSR, so the game support list is certainly something to consider here. Now this is getting the 3050 to almost match the frame rate. But again, this is DLSS balanced. This is pretty aggressive at 1080p. And look at the manes on the horses. Like, the hair in this game, just however it's programmed, just does not agree with the DLSS algorithm. Or maybe the way the hair was designed with the game's native TAA implementation in mind. Although I will say that that DLSS can clean up some of the messy TAA. But anyway, I think the better option here, if you want to stay above 60 FPS, is to optimize the settings. Now, HU optimized here is standing for Hardware Unboxed optimized settings. Many of you probably watch the Hardware Unboxed YouTube channel. If you don't, I recommend taking a look. But when Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, they did an incredibly in-depth two-part video series where they looked at the performance and visual quality impact of every setting in the game, and there's a lot of them when you go into the advanced settings, and arrived at these optimized settings, and they have a dramatic performance boost. I believe in that video they claimed 65% performance boost, and you can see here that it makes the 6600 a very high refresh rate experience, and even the 3050 is delivering well above 60 in most scenes. And so, yeah, I think that actually this is how I'd use the 3050, maybe the 6600, although the 6600 was doing well enough without optimizing the settings that I think we could very well have just kept it at maximum settings and been happy. But what about 1440p? In this one, I'm using the optimized settings for the 6600 on the right-hand side there. I'm using the optimized settings on the 3050 on the left-hand side here. But the middle here is the optimized settings with DLSS Quality. So you can get a bit of a visual quality comparison, as well as looking at, it doesn't give a massive performance boost, but at 1440p it looks a bit better. The hair still looks a bit weird to me. Although here you might be able to see what I mean about DLSS kind of sharpening a bit of the anti-aliasing in this game. The native anti-aliasing in this game is a bit fuzzy, so I feel like it makes the hair look significantly worse. Some elements do look slightly better. Now, I apologize that this benchmark, it doesn't give you an identical run every time around, which makes some of the side-by-side visual quality comparisons here not work quite as well as I would like, but that's just some slight run-to-run variation. Now, what about 4K? Well, using the optimized settings, we are not even going to attempt the ultra settings. Just trust me, the results are bad. Actually, both GPUs can kind of deliver a 30 FPS experience, with the 6600 actually getting up into the 40s at times. Although the 3050 will occasionally dip below 30, it's not going to be a complete locked 30 FPS experience. I thought this was kind of interesting because, again, these really aren't GPUs that you should buy for 4K. But I know a lot of people have maybe a 1080p PC monitor on their desk, but they also hook their PC up to a 4K TV and sometimes game on the couch, and you use it for both use cases. And if you're primarily gaming on your PC at the 1080p, then it makes sense to buy a 1080p graphics card. But what is your experience going to be like if you want to try to use it on your 4K screen? So for those of you wondering, why am I even looking at these at 4K so much? Well, for one thing, I just find it interesting. But for the other reason, like I just said, some people will use this. Now, this game does not feature FSR. So on the 6600, I tried out RSR, which is the driver version of FSR. But notice that you just run the game at 1440p and then it kind of applies an FSR filter to the final image rather than before post-processing and menus. On the left-hand side, I had to crank the DLSS all the way to Ultra Performance to match that the frame rates, well, roughly match the frame rates that we were getting on the 6600, which is rendering at 1440p. Ultra Performance is below 1080p, and you can definitely see it here. I think the AMD GPU is giving a significantly better image quality here. If you look at the little details, especially if you're on a 4K screen here, I think it's very apparent that RSR from 1440p looks significantly better than DLSS Ultra Performance. it's not even that close. It's a significantly better image quality on the right-hand side here. If you don't have a 4K screen, take my word for it. Now, Horizon Zero Dawn. First, we'll take a look at the 1080p Ultra settings. Now, this isn't the most demanding game in the world, but it is a pretty fun one, so thought we'd take a look. Also, I'm just picking games I actually own that have built-in benchmarks here. And we can see that both GPUs are delivering a solid frame rate, very playable, although the 6600 on some of these areas is actually a pretty high refresh rate experience, whereas as we dip into the city here, it gets a bit more demanding, and I think that's going to be more typical to the gameplay experience that you'll get. So here the 3050 is holding around 60 FPS, whereas the 6600 is still delivering a pretty high refresh rate experience. So yeah, both GPUs delivering solid performance at 1080p in this game. This game does feature both DLSS and FSR, although I didn't think that at 1080p that's really needed here, especially given that we're at the ultra settings here, and it's doing just fine. However, at 1440p, now, by the way, on the left-hand side, the screen capture seems a little bit blurry to me, guys, and I don't know why. I used the exact same recording method as everything else. It just seemed to come out a little bit blurry to my eye. I don't know why. Anyway, but we have the 3050 kind of struggling at 1440p Ultra. And we obviously could turn down settings, but since the game does feature DLSS Quality, I thought I'd go ahead and use that and see how that made it perform versus the 6600. Again, as the resolution increases, the gap between the 3050 and the 6600 will usually decrease. The 3050 kind of catches up, although not all the way. That's just due to the architecture difference between Ampere and RT92. But then, if you also use something like DLSS, it really is getting pretty close. They're within an FPS or two, and actually it can kind of jump either way scene by scene on which one has the 1 FPS lead between the two. Although image quality wise, 1440p DLSS quality does actually look pretty good. All right, after watching the benchmarks, the first thing I'll say is both GPUs are completely usable at 1080p, although the 6600 is certainly going to be easier to use at 1080p. In many games, you can just max out the settings and call it a day. Occasionally, you might want to switch down to high if you want to make sure that you're above 60 FPS, and unless we're talking ray tracing, that's pretty much all you need to do. If you're going up to 1440p, it's a bit more of a mixed bag, and games that support DLSS then do start to have the 3050 close that gap a bit. At 1080p, DLSS versus FSR, DLSS delivers far better results than FSR does at 1080p, although, as I said in the video, my personal preference is just to try to not render below 1080p, okay? At 1440p, DLSS starts to look pretty good. And then at 4K, it can deliver some good results, although we saw, FSR delivers better results, not better than DLSS necessarily at the same settings, but I mean, FSR is certainly more impressive at high resolutions like 4K as well, and really honestly, 4K was more of just a for fun exploration in this video rather than a main selling point. I think 1080p really is the focus here, and where we really do see the 6600, I think, delivering significantly better performance, enough so that it would be worth buying unless you do think you will be trying to use ray tracing. But let's think about pricing. Like I said at the beginning, if they're both at MSRP, it's $250 versus $330. That's actually a pretty huge difference. And whereas if the price starts closing into like $300 versus $330, I think grabbing the 6600 is a no-brainer. But if you're in a market like, I know everybody's in a different financial situation. For some people, $250 is absolutely stretching their budget, and going up to $330 is pretty much just out of the picture. So if that's the case for you, why'd you watch the video? The 6600 wasn't really an option, okay? Although, if you're watching this video in the future, it's entirely possible that we'll start seeing GPUs sold below MSRP. And I have a feeling that it's going to be the AMD GPUs that get pushed lower quicker, mostly due to, again, Nvidia having both more of a mind share and market share lead, as well as feature sets like their encoders, DLSS, better ray tracing, and all of that. So if the 3060s start coming down near their actual MSRP, around 330, I think that we'll start seeing 6600s creep down below that MSRP price point. But again, that's just kind of speculating. And bringing up the 3060, you might wonder, well, why didn't I put the 3060 in this video? It theoretically has the same MSRP as the 6600. Yeah, but that's not what it's actually selling for. And also, I'm going to do the 3060 video as well. We're definitely going to look at the 3050 versus the 3060. And I've already done some videos comparing the 6600 versus the 3060, so you could look into that as well. Anyway, this video is already really long, so I should probably just stop talking and let you guys argue about all of this in the comments section, because I know we've got all the Team Red versus Team Green stuff that I'm sure will be just an absolute pleasant experience for everyone to read through. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.